distinguished guests, physicians, and particularly Professor Andrew Cole, who has asked me to present this oration today. I have been asked to speak on the evolution of the NDIS, putting disability on the map. It is a great honour to be asked to deliver this address on the National Disability Insurance Scheme, widely accepted as the most ambitious social reform since Medicare, an institution with which all of you will be very familiar. As with most overnight sensations, the NDIS was many years in the making. Over 40 years in my experience, and even more for some of my colleagues. Over that period of gestation, many streams have contributed to its evolution. I hope you will grant me the indulgence to focus on my own, which is the story I know best, and borrow from those of a few close colleagues. I need to emphasise that the observation, views and opinions which I will express are entirely my own and not necessarily attributable to the National Disability Insurance Agency, the NDIA, of which I am a board member. My story starts on the 11th of July 1971 at about 3 p.m. when a simple contact on a rugby league field left me on the ground struggling for breath and unable to move any part of my body. My most vivid memory of the immediate time around the injury is asking my mother to take off my shoes and socks because my feet felt hot. I could tell instantly from the look on her face that I wasn't wearing any shoes. I lost consciousness in St George Hospital, Sydney, having overheard the doctors tell my parents I needed immediate surgery to resolve the fracture dislocation in my neck and I may not survive the night. I awoke 3 days later in the spinal unit of the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney to the faces of Mr John Grant, sadly now passed away, and Professor John Yeo, physicians to both of whom I owe an enormous debt. My childhood had been blessed up to that point. My family was a happy place and I remember nothing but support from my parents and siblings. I was successful at school and sport and in the third year of a physics and mathematics degree at the University of Sydney. My only experience with disability was a vague knowledge of the spastic kids who lived in big hospitals somewhere and Stanley from down the road who wandered the streets in his pyjamas and who I had been instructed to stay away from and not to stare at. I actually got on pretty well with Stanley. I was now right in the middle of it, sitting in a wheelchair, wearing hand splints to stop my fingers from curling, and attending day program type occupational therapy where I used splints to hammer copper sheets and depended on others for all of my most basic personal care needs. Fortunately, my school community had raised funds to make my parents' home wheelchair accessible. But after 7 months in hospital, I still needed to spend a short time in a nursing home, sharing a ward with 5 men at various stages of dementia and disinhibition. Not an ideal surrounding for a 20-year-old football player. I can readily understand how one's spirit would be destroyed, if only as a self-defense mechanism, if forced to stay there for any length of time. I note that at the time of NDIS rollout in 2013, there were about 7,000 young people in residential aged care in Australia. I fought the fact of my disability and hated the labels associated with it. Unfortunately, however, the funds raised on my behalf did not extend to modifying access at the University of Sydney. And in addition, the burden on my parents, ferrying me backwards and forwards every day to lectures and tutorials, became unsustainable. At this stage in my life, still less than 12 months after injury, I was stuck, until once again rescued by one of my doctors, again Mr Grant, who arranged for me to be given a trial employment position in a small firm of Sydney consulting actuaries. My mother drove me to and from work in the city 3 days a week, and then worked all day at her own job, until I managed to get a driver's licence using hand controls about 4 years after my injury. I was very lucky and I knew it. Some of my employers were members of Rotary International, and I was asked to speak at Rotary meetings where I focused on the lack of psychological support when the medical process had done its work. and particularly the bits about how a 20-year-old high-level quadriplegic can still live a self-fulfilling life across all of the dimensions which are important to young people. I was sponsored in 1980, still in my 20s, to undertake a Rotary International study tour on spinal cord injury rehabilitation and re-entry into the community. Scary, but at that point in my life I felt I had little to lose. I was by now learning to live in the community, supported by my football and workmates who helped me transfer on a sliding board to and from my car, helped me with personal care during the daytime, and for nearly 40 years helped me push around the city in my manual wheelchair. Until quite recently I was too stubborn, some might say too stupid, to give in to my overworked shoulders and get an electric wheelchair. I was still very dependent on my parents, and they continued as my primary carers for nearly 20 years after my injury. Unbeknownst to me, in NDIS language, I was using the community and informal supports to meet my needs. I did not receive any government-funded support until 1990, nearly 20 years after my accident. I was fortunate in my time overseas to spend time with leaders of the emerging disability rights and independent living movements in North America. Doug Mowat, a rugby accident quadriplegic, and in the early 1980s, already a Member of Parliament in British Columbia, Canada. Elmer Bartels, another sports injury quadriplegic and long-term Commissioner of Massachusetts Rehabilitation. And Ed Roberts, a polio quadriplegic and activist who now has a campus named in his honour at the University of California, Berkeley. I note with interest that, like myself, these three giants had never been burdened with accident compensation litigation or the bureaucratic processes of government funding. They relied on making their way in the community with help from friends, colleagues and family. Of course, not everyone has the resilience and drive of these men. And so a message for the NDIS must be to shape the same opportunities through creative ways of funding and building capacity. I also became close to a group of US Vietnam vets while spending a couple of weeks attached to a Veterans Administration hospital near Boston. A different world indeed, and reminiscent of the TV show MASH and the John Voight movie Coming Home. These men and others like them had achieved world-changing legislative reform with the 1973 US Rehabilitation Act and later the 1990 Americans with Disability Act. United Nations declared 1981 the International Year of Disabled People, IYDP. Politically questionable language today, but back then a great victory. I came back to Australia inspired by this experience and signed up as a mature age student to study disability and special education at Macquarie University, then a very left field degree in Australia. Again, the medical profession stepped in. Professor Bob Oakeshott convinced me that my actuarial qualifications could make a more significant contribution than my somewhat questionable advocacy skills. And I became very involved in the emerging reforms of accident compensation, which had begun in New Zealand with the work of Sir Owen Woodhouse, and which had adopted the same rehabilitation theme as I had seen in the US, although not yet an understanding of the independent living concept. Years later, I was very proud to be one of a group which brought Sir Owen to Australia in the lead up to the NDIS and saw him reunited with Prime Minister Whitlam, with whom he had collaborated in the 1970s. As a side note, these men were born a few days apart in 1916 and died a few days apart nearly 100 years later. I became hooked on the potential of insurance models to provide the community leverage funding required to meet the inevitable long-term increase in demand for disability support, the longitudinal data sets required to provide adequate monitoring, the governance models to keep it equitable and sustainable, and the need for an outcome focused across all of life's domains, not just the medical models. These ideas generated enough interest for a consortium of the Insurance Council of Australia, the New Australian Institute of Health, and the New South Wales Government Insurance Office to establish a research fund, allowing me to leave my job and focus on the data and statistics of disability, which I did from 1985 to 1990. This led to a fledgling registry of spinal cord injury incidents, prevalence and outcomes in Australia. I have to smile when I see the similarities with the emerging longitudinal database of the NDIS. By 1992, this registry lived on a self-programmed personal computer in my spare bedroom, populated with a huge amount of sensitive personal information on thousands of people. I shudder to think what today's privacy commissioners would make of it. It needed a more credible home and was taken over by the National Injury Surveillance Unit. Sadly, due to funding restrictions, the new registry was reduced. And of course, the first component to be sacrificed was outcomes. Now an incident registry only, it operated for many years and is currently being revisited 25 years later, ironically this time with an outcomes focus in mind. Over the 1980s, parallel stories were emerging, which would have a huge impact on the evolution of the NDIS. The US independent living movement and IYDP had spurred a group of young Australians to lobby for similar independent living rights. People I met later, like Leslie Hall and Rob Melnick in Melbourne, and Brian Newton and David Bryce in Sydney. And a bit later, of course, my good friend and colleague, Rhonda Galbally, who now chairs the NDIS Independent Advisory Council. My work was on the periphery of this group, but we developed a symbiotic relationship as they became interested in my data and analytics, and I learnt from their life experience and vision. These guys set out to change the historic model of disability management. Up until now, people with disability whose families were unable to cope with the demands or handle the stigma associated with disability were mainly housed in large congregate accommodation facilities, sometimes of several hundred people. I still shudder when I think of the name Homes for the Incurables in various places throughout Australia. Some of these, of course, still exist with different names, with residents who have not left for 40 or 50 years. During the daytime, those who could were often ferried en masse to sheltered workshops as a means of cost-effectively trying to add some value to their lives. Consumer-led organisations emerged, such as Disabled People's International, DPI, and lobbied strongly on the back of international change. Deinstitutionalisation became a buzzword in Australia, aiming to replace the huge soulless accommodation facilities with smaller group accommodation. The Commonwealth Disability Services Act was passed in 1986, which, in words anyway, established the rights of people with a disability. The Home and Community Care Act came a little later. The attendant care program became available, and it now became a realistic option for people to live in small accommodation with the necessary drop-in support. Day programs began to emerge away from institutions with the goal of offering people an option of at least some type of social activity. The Commonwealth State Disability Agreements emerged around 1990, and these provided a basic platform for disability funding. It's anyone's guess how the overall funding was determined, highly likely, however, that there was not much science involved. As with other areas of the economy, if the 1980s was a decade of hope and discovery, the 1990s was one of disappointment and disillusionment. Notwithstanding the carriage of the Disability Discrimination Act in 1992, the holy grail of inclusive mainstream services remained elusive, as it does to this day. Routine facilitators of community engagement, such as education, transport, housing, and access to the health system, remain a major challenge for anyone who does not fit the typical mould. The much anticipated smaller group home model in many cases became reduced to a network of mini institutions, with the residents having no real additional independence. Day programs and sheltered workshops were often holding pens with an inexpensive staff to client ratio. It must be acknowledged that the charitable organisations contracted by government to provide much of this support undoubtedly had the best will in the world. What has become evident, however, is that many people with a disability have the potential to achieve much more and have the right to be given that opportunity. It also emerged towards the end of the 1990s that the funding available for disability support was badly inadequate, with increasing upward pressure on budget estimates. This became manifest through the so-called death spiral effect, in which families, usually elderly mothers, could no longer physically care for their adult children, often now 50 years old or more. This carer crisis situation was exacerbated by the emerging demographics of far smaller family units and increased female workforce participation. The stock of free carers was drying up. Ration funding meant that the only way out for these families was to create the need for a so-called emergency response by relinquishing care of their adult child and creating a political problem. The system response was high unit cost, over $200,000 per annum per person in today's terms, which would suck out perhaps 10 or 20 low-cost respite type spots, thereby placing more families in the crisis situation and escalating the risk. Cost escalation in the early 2000s in the disability system was of the order of 7% per annum above inflation. Meanwhile, in my 1990s world of insurance and accident compensation, we were having our own struggles. The new models of accident compensation were taking time to stabilise, with frequent reviews and legislative change. The advantage they had was that the more sophisticated data monitoring and governance models identified these issues quickly and allowed the appropriate response, usually before runaway cost escalation. Also, liability insurance hit a wall towards the end of the decade. HIH FAI failed spectacularly, and Australia's largest medical indemnity insurer, UMP, was on the ropes. This led to a Commonwealth State Review of Civil Liability Legislative Frameworks, the IP Review, which found, among other significant matters, the need to investigate models other than the fault-based common law for major injuries such as spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury. Models like the Victorian TAC system, which, while having its own struggles in the early 2000s, had nonetheless survived for many years and still does. So in the early 2000s, we had several parallel forces operating. Firstly, a consolidated revenue-funded disability system, which was highly inflationary, provided a relatively high level of funding to a very small proportion of people, and with no real outcome monitoring or accountability focus. In the meantime, a much larger proportion were struggling in desperate situations with families or with nothing at all. Secondly, an insurance premium funded accident compensation system which did not provide any cover for most people who sustained a disabling accident requiring lifetime support, and who also usually fell through the cracks in the disability system. Thirdly, an increasingly disenfranchised social movement of people with a disability demanding their rights of funding support to achieve independent community participation, and families and carers demanding recognition and support in respect of the burden placed on them through the failures and inequity of the system. By 2005, I was working on these issues from the actuarial perspective, providing a feasibility study to a COAG joint committee of treasurers and finance ministers on a national no-fault catastrophic injury scheme, and advising the New South Wales and other state governments on the fiscal risk of their disability system from an unmet need and latent demand perspective. The former work led to a recommendation that states explore the possibility of extending or amending their accident compensation schemes to carve out catastrophic injury as a no-fault component. For example, the New South Wales Lifetime Care and Support Scheme. And the latter work to a major funding injection and redesign of the New South Wales disability system over the 10 years 2006 to 2016, an initiative which became known as Stronger Together. These models were to later feed into the technical design around the NIIS and the NDIS respectively. On the other side of the fence, governments were beginning to respond to the emerging political pressure from carers and people with a disability. In 2008, Australia was one of the first countries to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of People with a Disability, Rhonda Galbally was appointed chair of the new National People with Disabilities and Carers Council, and the National Disability Strategy was established to achieve an agreement between the Commonwealth and states on how these issues would be addressed. The Council's shutout report became a major vehicle for advocacy in the lead up to the NDIS. All this came together from about 2008, when the Disability Investment Group, the DIG, was formed by the Commonwealth to look at innovative ways of funding disability. On this group I worked with Bruce Bonihady, whom I had met a little earlier, and who had also been networking and exploring the idea of an insurance model for disability. Bruce took the concept to the Australia 2020 Summit, where it found a high level of favour. Bruce deserves a special mention as the major advocate of the scheme and the tireless public representative of it as the inaugural chair of the NDIA. Following the recommendation of the DIG report, The Way Forward, a reference was made to the Productivity Commission in 2009. I was asked to participate as an Associate Commissioner. These were exciting times. Again, under the guidance of Rhonda, the three disparate advocacy arms of disability, people with disability, service providers and carers, came together in an unlikely alliance. Supported largely by the New South Wales Government and a strong band of disability service providers, the Alliance sponsored a grassroots support campaign, Every Australian Counts, fronted by John Delabosco, a former State Minister, and had more than 200,000 supporters by the launch of the scheme. The PC inquiry was very extensive, with 2 rounds of public hearings, over 1,000 submissions, and famously found that the old disability system was, quote, underfunded, unfair, fragmented and inefficient, and gave people with disabilities little choice, unquote. It recommended a national disability insurance scheme operated according to insurance principles by an independent agency under the governance of an expert board and a state-based national injuries insurance scheme. On a personal note, until my time on the Productivity Commission, I thought I understood the disability system. I found I had no concept of the depths of desperation of some families. A frequent question was, who will take care of my child when I die? With the occasional tragic plan being to take them along. The Every Australian Counts campaign ensured bilateral political support and a surprisingly quick passage to unanimous support from COAG, only a couple of months after we presented the report to government on 31 July 2011. Of course, for the next 12 to 18 months, the design of the scheme and legislative frameworks were formed through Commonwealth state negotiations and committees of high-level government officials, with a very rapid launch on 1 July 2013. Management of the scheme was the responsibility of the NDIA, a Commonwealth entity within the portfolio of social services, with Chief Executive David Bowen and a governing board of directors. The agency's job is to deliver the NDIS, build community awareness of disability, ensure financial sustainability of the NDIS, and develop and enhance the disability sector. The NDIS proposes a new way to provide support for people with a disability by offering reasonable and necessary supports to help people achieve goals in a financially sustainable way. It is estimated that at full launch, 460,000 people will be receiving individual packages. The scheme is based on 3 pillars: an insurance approach, choice and control for participants, and the development of community and mainstream support. Trials were initially established in the Hunter region of New South Wales, the Barwon region of Victoria, early childhood whole of state in South Australia, and young adult whole of state in Tasmania. Additional trials came on stream in Perth Hills, the Barkly region of Northern Territory, the whole of ACT, and early childhood in the Nepean Blue Mountains area of Western Sydney. We are still only about 20% to full scheme, but as you can see from the trajectory on the slide, with a great deal of activity scheduled over the next few years. Full scheme launch began on 1 July 2016, and as at 31 December last, over 61,000 people had received individual plans. An early childhood early intervention gateway has been established and over $5 billion has been committed in support to participants. The ramp up to full scheme in 2019 will nevertheless be challenging. Participants across the whole range of ages have joined the scheme, with the highest proportion in early childhood and school age. By disability type, by far the highest proportions are in intellectual disability and autism. However, this is at this stage heavily influenced by the age profile. As at 1 January this year, we have a new board, chaired by Helen Nugent, and strangely I kept my place. The challenges ahead are daunting, but I believe the board has the depth of expertise required to meet these challenges. It has been a privilege to be involved in this remarkable history. I owe a great deal of debt to the medical profession, and in particular rehabilitation specialists. You helped my body back into some sort of shape and did not resist too much when I pushed out into the real world. You provided wise advice and support when I needed it. My parting plea is that the medical profession respects the goals of the NDIS to build support frameworks for people with disability around their communities, with access to appropriate and disability knowledgeable medical support when medical problems present themselves. Be brave in cutting the umbilical cord when people can't bring themselves to venture outside the safe world of therapy. Boundary issues on the NDIS need to be understood. Doctors are in a position of trust and privilege, and rather think of NDIS funding as the universal panacea. You can help us enormously, and your patients, by encouraging them to engage with community and mainstream supports. Having said that, I am the first to admit that we need to work harder to get these in place as a matter of urgency. When people with disabilities do venture into the health system, it would be wonderful if clinicians had a better appreciation of the particular challenges which make it more difficult for them. Issues such as challenges with understanding or the presence of medical complications which may not be manifest in a quick visit to the GP. We still have a long way to go, as I am constantly reminded, most ironically on mornings of NDIS board meetings, when I lie in bed worrying and waiting for a support worker to turn up in the morning to get me out of bed and dressed, or a wheelchair taxi to arrive on time. The full scheme launch of the NDIS is daunting and challenging, and there is a sense that the collegiality which carried the scheme is now being sorely tested. But my sense is that we can't now put the genie back in the bottle. The sense of support for the fundamentals of the scheme has not diminished, and hopefully will win out in the end. Is disability on the map, as implied by the title of my oration? It is certainly not yet an independent republic, but thanks to the efforts of the people I have mentioned, I think it has moved a little beyond a protectorate.